We anchored in the outer bay and pumped up the dinghy and went to town. It was really active. We decided to go to the restaurant we had gone to on Sunday, but it was closed, so we settled on Captain Jack's. After we ate, Wanda and Nick went shopping, which amounted to about 3 shops, including the sailbag shop, and I took the dinghy over to the public landing. While waiting on them to get back, I met several interesting people that were staying there for the week. There were even 2 guys with the Boy Scouts that were from Columbus, Ohio. Wanda stopped back by the sailbag place and was really interested in getting one, but she didn't. After they finished shopping, we took the dinghy over to the lighthouse and took a tour of it. On the 14th, we got up early, pulled anchor, and headed to Man o' War. This is where our priest Stacy and her husband Stephen spent their honeymoon. Getting into Man o' War was difficult because the shoreline didn't match either the electronic charts nor the paper charts. We finally found a place that was close to the charts and dropped anchor. We took the dinghy into the channel that led into Man o' War and tied up at the marina and had lunch. We then found a golf cart rental and started exploring the island. It is narrow, only about a half-mile wide, but close to 4 miles long, just a tad longer than North Bimini. But on the north end, it was beautiful as the strip of land was only about 500 feet across, and on one side was the Atlantic, which had rugged coastline. The other side was the Sea of Abaco, which had gentle white beaches. Reverend Stacy told us that what she remembered most were the beautiful poinsettias that grew everywhere. We couldn't find any, so we asked a lady that was on the way down to the beach, and she said they didn't start blooming until November. During our sightseeing, we ran across a shop that sold different items made of sailcloth, so we stopped in. The items were not the quality of the ones in Hopetown, so we left. We pulled anchor at 10 o'clock the morning of the 15th and headed to, wait for it, yep, Hopetown again. Wanda decided that she couldn't live without a handbag made of sailcloth. We dropped anchor close to the same place we were the previous time, put the dinghy in the water, and headed back to town. We ate lunch at Harbor's Edge, which just happened to be next door to the sailbag shop. She and Nick walked over and she finally got her sailbag purse. Our next destination was the Great Guiana Key. We pulled up anchor around 1 o'clock and raised the sails. We had a good wind as we passed Man o' War, and for a while after that. We had to start the motor about an hour away from the anchorage. We motored into Fisher's Bay at the Great Guiana Key about 4 p.m. and dropped anchor. We then got into the dinghy and headed over to the shore, but first we took a detour over to the inlet where the marina was. As soon as we got into the open water, the waves increased about tenfold, and even in the inlet, the waves were still pretty high. So we turned around, drove back into the Fisher's Bay, and went on shore. There was music, dancing, and partying, so I asked one of the patrons if this was a private club. "No way, man, it's Grabbers." We ordered drinks and started listening to this one-man band named Steel Daddy, and he was really good. On one song, if you closed your eyes, you'd swear it was Zach Brown and his group singing. It rained till 3 p.m. and then the sun came out. We dinghied over to Grabbers and walked around for about 6 blocks and decided the only way you could see the island was by cart. We rented one and then went to Nippers to check it out. On the way down, we explored different paths to see the real island. Nippers was a bar, but also had a swimming pool, some shops, and a beautiful view of the Atlantic. We went into one of the shops and they had a sand floor. We looked around and got a few souvenirs. We parked the cart in the lot and headed back to the boat. We got up the next morning. I channeled to 69, but nothing on the Whale. We pulled anchor and headed north. We got to the North Guiana Key and dropped anchor as it looked like the storm was coming. I called out on channel 16 to see if I could get anything on the Whale, but nothing. We napped and then got up and I tried 16 and 68 again. I was answered by a guy in a catamaran that said it was pretty good and the seas were only a foot. I promised Wanda that if we got there and it was bad, we would turn around. We then headed to the Whale. We got to the Whale, into it, and it wasn't any different than the rest of our passage, just a little bumpy. We did notice that boats coming out of the other direction were being slammed by the waves, but they were all motorboats. We were expecting the Whale to be maybe 50 to 100 yards wide, but it was over a mile wide, and the shoreline was beautiful but rocky. We got to Green Turtle Key a little late, so we went to the north side and dropped anchor in Coca Bay. Since we had been under anchor for a few days, we had run out of water in the first tank and had switched to the second, smaller tank. Also, our fuel was getting low, so we needed to fill up as our next destination was the U.S. We had a great dinner and relaxed for the evening, and I quickly checked the route to Fort Pierce and found it was about 170 miles back. And at averaging 5 knots, it would take 34 hours if we could make that average. The next morning we got up, pulled the anchor, and headed down to the Green Turtle Marina. Checked in. When they asked how long we'd be staying, I told them at least a couple of days. Since they were pretty full, they told me that I may have to move the boat unless they had a cancellation. We went over to see if we could reserve a golf cart the next day, but they were out. The entire island was out. So we walked around, then made reservations to the Green Turtle Yacht Club restaurant. It was first class. Checked in with the marina on the 21st and found out we didn't have to move the boat. So I checked the charts and found that we would break the trip to Fort Pierce into 3 legs. It wouldn't be as taxing, and we wouldn't have to sail at night. So we planned that the first day we would sail to Great Sail Key, which was 11.5 hours, then on to the Bahamas Shelf, called Little Bahama Bank, which was 10.2 hours, and then on to Fort Pierce, another 12.5 hours. Wanda had been talking about stopping by the No Name Key, which has pigs running free, and you can feed them. It was below Green Turtle Key, and since it was late getting there from the Whale, we decided to drop down when we left Green Turtle. We got into the dinghy and motored over to New Plymouth, which was just an inlet over, had lunch at Harvey's, and walked around the town. After we were done, we motored back to the marina. We had started talking to someone, and they told us about sea turtles that were in Coco Bay. They said that sometimes there are 3 of them and sometimes a shark. We checked out the distance and found it was just a short walk, so off we went. There were a couple of couples there when we arrived, and they told us that there was a turtle off the end of the pier. Nick had his swimming trunks on, so he went into the water and found it. He gave it some food, played around for a while, and was ready to get out when a nurse shark was seen at the end of the pier. Wanda ran over and got his picture. It started getting dark, so we headed back to the boat.
Sitting here, I got time. It's clear to see from up here. The world seems small. We can sit together. It's so beautiful, you and me. We meant to be in the great outdoors, forever free. Take a step back to see the truth around you. From a distance you can tell. You and me were meant to be outdoors, forever free. You and me, meant to be in the great outdoors, forever free.
It was a 2-hour sail from Green Turtle to No Name Key, and when we arrived there were several boats, including a sightseeing boat already there. We dropped the dive platform and dinghied to the island, and there were the pigs. Wanda and Nick started feeding them, and the pigs started getting a little pushy. All of a sudden Wanda let out a yelp as one nipped her. By the time we were ready to leave No Name Key, it was a little later than what we had anticipated. So I recalculated where we would stop and decided instead of going to Great Sail Key, we would stop at Foxtown, Little Abaco. left No Name Key to head north, with the next stop being Foxtown. The sailing was smooth, kind of like the movies where they had all their martinis, but it was really boring. We arrived in Foxtown just as the sun was setting and dropped anchor. The next day we left Foxtown about 8:30 and headed to our next destination, Mangrove Key. By this time we were sailing west with the wind from the north. It was rather a bumpy ride and the winds varied from 2 to 10 knots, so we had the engine on most of the time. We arrived at Mangrove Key and dropped anchor, spent the night. The next morning we got up and headed for the Great Bahama Banks. We arrived at the Great Bahama Banks, and according to the chart there was supposed to be a couple areas that had a depth of 10 to 15 feet, but we couldn't find either. It was getting late and we seemed to be in the route that the sailors were taking to go from Florida to the Bahamas. We dropped anchor in 20 foot of water in a place we thought was off their track, but while sitting there we saw a couple of boats were heading directly towards us, and we thought they were going to collide, but they veered off at the last minute. It was a little bumpy at first, but by the time we went to bed, the wind had kicked up, and since we were so close to the Bahama shelf, so did the waves. It was pretty bad when all of a sudden the alarm of the PC went off. We were dragging anchor. We got up, turned on the lights, hauled anchor, and headed to Fort Pierce. It was now midnight. We had about 20 knots of wind, and the sail was pretty smooth. Wanda and Nick were below resting, and the boat was hitting 9 knots. I saw in the distance a large ship that we would intersect with, so when we got close, I veered off, pointing to where the back of the ship had been. After he passed, I resumed my original course and stayed on it for the rest of the night. Just as the sun was rising, the wind died down, so I turned on the motor for the remainder of the trip. It was Sunday, June 25th, when we got to the first buoy outside the Fort Pierce Inlet. I did, they answered, and we had a place to stay, at least for the night. Wanda got directions from a guy, and he told her that if she messed him up, we just weren't good sailors. We proceeded up the inlet, and since it was Sunday, it was packed. We made a right turn according to his directions and ran aground. Had to back up to the middle of the inlet and tried a different way. Same results. Wanda called the marina, and a different person answered. She told him where we were and also the other guy's direction. He thought for a minute and determined that the first person thought that we were coming in from the ICW, not the Atlantic. So he gave us the correct directions, and we proceeded to the marina without any further problems. We were put at the fuel pier and got hooked up. The depth gauge was showing about 6 feet, so I asked the guy where we were on the tide table. We were going into low tide, and he said we would probably sink into the muck, but that wouldn't be a problem. It wasn't, and we never even noticed the boat touching. The next morning we got up to check the office for a new slip. He gave us one, so we moved the boat over there and reconnected. After reconnecting, I called Enterprise and got a car. We then headed to Sam's and got stocked up as we were pretty low on supplies. But on the way I stopped in the marine store to get those joker valves, but as I entered there were no shells. I asked the lady sitting at the desk where the supplies were, and she told me that they just worked on boats, didn't sell any supplies. She called the manager, Jeff, and he came out, and I told him about the keel and rudder that we had dinged up. He checked the schedule, gave me an estimate, and told me that we could get the boat hauled out Wednesday morning. When we got back to the boat and unloaded, Wanda brought out a small cake and we celebrated my 75th birthday. On Tuesday, we went over to the office and signed up for a month at the marina. Since they had 24 hours to get checked back into the U.S., we drove over to the airport and got checked in. We then drove around looking for a hotel to stay at that was inexpensive, as we needed a room for a week when the boat would be on the hard. We found a nice one named the Three Palms, west of town, and it was about a half hour away from the marina. After that, we headed to the West Marine to get a couple of jerker valves and also 2 backflow valves to replace the ones that came with the boat. Not sure if you noticed, but the water in Fort Pierce is so different than the Bahamas, as you can see. But we found out that while sitting in the marina in the Bahamas, a lot of sailors leave the valves open that comes from the holding tank, so everything from the toilet goes straight into the water. In the U.S., that'd be a $10,000 fine just for the first offense. We followed the U.S. rules while there and didn't open the holding tank valve until we were at least 3 miles from land. So, warning, do not swim in a marina. I called my cousin Julie, whose sister used to live in Vero Beach the last we heard, which was about 10 years ago. She still lived there, and Julie gave me Susie's number. I called her and she stopped over at the marina. She was heading to North Carolina to meet her husband Byron, and would be there for a week. She said if I wanted to go to the airport with her, I could use her SUV for the week. Marydell, my sister, and granddaughter, Maddie, were arriving in St. Pete that week, so we drove over to see them. When Susie and Byron got back from North Carolina, Mary and Maddie and a friend of Maddie's drove down from St. Pete, and Susie and Byron met us, and we sat on the boat reminiscing. Other interesting things that happened in Fort Pierce was that Susie and Byron came over to the marina in their runabout and took us on a tour. We saw our first manatee and then went up to the ICW looking for porpoises, as she is the head of the Florida Wild Porpoise Department, which she started many years ago. She tags and tracks them so they can determine their migration path.